Light. It's something we usually take for granted when thinking of starting a garden, because after all, that's one of the three main things that plants need. Water, soil, light. But how much light do plants actually need? If you start looking at labels at the gardening center, you might see plant in full sun, which usually means 8 or more hours of sunlight a day. But not everyone has access to that kind of sunlight in their yard. Like my first garden. I had a thin strip of dirt on the side of an apartment building that only got 1 to 2 hours of sunlight every day. A lot of people might say don't even try starting a garden there because you're not going to have a lot of success. Well, I'm here to tell you they're wrong. I did this just because I wanted to garden, and I met with a lot more success than I thought I would. So these are all the plants that worked and didn't work in my full shade apartment garden. Now, I thought I would do this a little bit differently because I think a tier list will be the best way to capture the full spectrum of my successes and failures. And like I said, you might be surprised with exactly how many did so well in the full shade scenario. To explain the tiers a little bit, S tier is it went perfectly, this was a fantastic plant for full shade. A tier is it did really, really well, with maybe a couple minor caveats. B tier is I had successful growth, but there were maybe some larger inconveniences. C tier is where the plants were starting to struggle a bit. I still had varying levels of success. These are plants you might want to try yourself, but definitely be wary of them. D tier is things that kind of worked, but I just definitely don't recommend. And then F tier is the complete failures. So to start us off, we have raspberries. And raspberries are going right into F tier. Try as it might, it grew and grew like crazy. It just never would produce flowers. I think it was reaching for the sun that it could not find, and it just didn't have enough energy to do what it needed to do. Next up is borage, and we're going to put this in the B tier. Now the reason I'm putting it here is because it did flower, and both the bees and I really enjoyed it, but it got very leggy and tall, and it just didn't seem structurally sound enough to be that tall. It kept falling over, I had to stake it up, so a little extra work on that one. Onions are a notoriously sun-needy plant, and therefore they're going in the D tier. I did get onions, but they were about ping pong sized, if not a bit smaller. And I think for the space in your garden, you're just going to be better off putting something else in there. Coreopsis is next, and those are going in the A tier. They did really well for me. They bloomed fantastically. Like the borage, they got leggy. They were like 5 to 6 feet tall, where they're normally like 3 to 4 feet. But they didn't really suffer from falling over, even if it was, a little bit weird sometimes with how tall those got. Next up is basil, and that is going in the S tier. I had 4 plants of this, and I had more basil than I knew what to do with. It just got out of control, so it did really well for me. Garlic is going in the F tier, unfortunately. As much as I love it, it is not suited for full shade. It tried to grow, it really did, but it just ended up dying out without producing anything. Next up, kale is going to go in the C tier. It did grow for me, but it grew slowly. It got shaded out by some of the other plants, which didn't help at all. But even when it was growing, it didn't look super healthy. I think leafy plants might need more sun. Rosemary is going to go in the B tier. It grew fine. I had no issues with it. But you should know it grew super slowly. So if you plan to grow this in a full shade scenario, I would suggest knowing you'll need to wait a year probably before you can get any harvest. Alyssum is up next, and this is going to go in the A tier. And it grew pretty well. But I did plant a few purple varieties that just never turned purple, and I think that's because of the sun. They probably need more to create that pigment. Bachelor's button, on the other hand, is going in the S tier. It grew great for me, lots of blooms, never got leggy. Great flower for your garden if you're in a full shade scenario. Now, sunflowers, you might expect from the name, would need a lot of sun, but you would be wrong. Because sunflowers are going in the S tier. I planted 2 of these, and they both grew great. One grew to the recommended 5 to 6 feet, producing beautiful blooms like this one. The other grew to 13 feet and was just a tower of flowers. Fantastic experience. I was shocked how well these did in full shade. But yeah, I definitely recommend you give them a try. Next up, we have watermelon radishes, and I'm going to put these in the B tier. You can see they bulbed up to a decent size, but the seed packet will tell you that only takes 60 days, but for me it was more like 90 plus. So they took longer to grow, and then unfortunately, similar to the Alyssum, they never developed a really deep pink center like their namesake suggests. And again, I think that's because I didn't get the light and the energy they needed to create that pigment. Cauliflower is going to go into the S tier. This just grew super well for me. It was probably my easiest plant in full shade. I got good-sized heads from it, no complaints. Blueberries are going to go in the A tier. I got a slightly small yield. It could have been because it was the first year that I had the plant, but overall they did pretty well, so I definitely recommend blueberries. Oregano is going to go in the S tier as well. It did get off to a little bit of a slow start, but man, it just exploded in growth and I had a ton of this stuff. Strawberries are also going in the S tier. I would have thought they would have needed more sun, but these produced great for me. They were maybe my best producers. I got 2 pounds off of 2 plants, and they were producing big berries like this all through the summer. Carrots, on the other hand, I'm going to put in the C tier. You can see these got decently thick, but just not very long. And unfortunately, this was after leaving them there for 5 months. Usually you can leave carrots in the ground and they'll continue to grow, but these just were struggling the whole time. They really need more sun. Feel free to give them a shot because I did get something of a yield. They're like slightly bigger than baby carrots, but yeah, this was one of the more rough ones. Now, tomatoes are another notorious sun-loving plant, but I'm going to put these in the A tier. They produce super well for me. I got over 1.5 gallons of tomatoes off of 2 plants, and that was despite losing probably like 50% of them to bugs and other things. Now, I will say they were on the smaller side, so they didn't get as large as I think a tomato plant in full sun would do. And these were also Roma tomatoes, so paste tomatoes. So if you were trying to grow a beefsteak, that might be an issue, because it might not get to that big size that it typically would. But other paste tomatoes and probably cherry tomatoes, I think they would do well in full shade. They did well for me. Next up, marigolds are going in the S tier. Similar to the Bachelor's button, no complaints. They bloomed great, just produced well throughout the entire season. Echinacea, or purple coneflower, is going to go in the B tier. They did produce blooms, but they didn't look great. They looked like they were struggling a little bit. They could have been other growing conditions, it could have been the seeds, but I would definitely try these again. They just weren't my best performers that season. Lavender is going to go in the F tier. Similar to the other things in this list, it really tried to grow, but it just couldn't do it and it died off. Now, with cauliflower in the S tier, you might think broccoli would go there as well, but I'm going to put this in the B tier. Unlike the cauliflower, it got super leggy. I had to stake it up. I did get broccoli heads that produced something for me, but it was a little bit of a struggle. Black-eyed Susans are going to go in the A tier. Similar to the purple coneflowers, they did struggle a little bit, but they seemed to do better and they produced more flowers, so that's why I'm bumping them up a little bit. Chamomile is also going in the A tier. This produced really well for me. I got to harvest all summer from it. But I think looking back, the yield was a little bit small, and that was probably because of the lack of light. Now, squash are going to go in the F tier, and you'll notice here I only have a picture of a squash blossom, not an actual squash. And that's because that's all I got from this plant. It took over one of my beds entirely, and I never got a single female flower. That could have been multiple issues, but I think number one was the lack of sunlight and energy it needed to produce a squash. So I do not recommend squash if you're growing a full shade garden. And then last, but certainly not least, morning glories are going in the S tier. These grew like crazy for me. I got a ton of blooms, and it was just a really beautiful addition to the garden. So if you need something to lighten it up, I'd definitely recommend morning glories. Now looking at this final list, I was pretty surprised with how well so many of these did. You got a great selection of things that will work in a full shade scenario. Even a few things that you typically would not hear did well. And when I was researching how to start a full shade garden, I couldn't find a lot of information out there, because not a lot of people do it or recommend it. So I hope if you're in this type of scenario, this list is helpful for you. It's the research that I was looking for when I was starting my garden, and I hope it encourages you to at least try things. You have a good starting off point for what might work and what might not work, but if all you have is a little bit of space and you don't get a lot of light, don't be afraid to just put the plants out there. Worst thing that happens is it's a learning experience. And at Scott Learns Farming, we love to learn. But anyways, that's it for now, guys. And if you want to see some of the other struggles I faced with pests in this garden, feel free to check out this video. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time.